The streets of downtown were alive with the usual chaos: cars honking, hurried footsteps on the pavement, and the occasional siren wailing in the distance. Officer Ryan Walker moved through it all with the weight of frustration pressing down on him. It had been one of those mornings. His coffee had spilled in the car, his radio wouldn't stop buzzing with trivial calls, and now right in the middle of his patrol, he spotted something that made his already sour mood even worse. A homeless man. He was slumped against the brick wall of a high-end restaurant, wrapped in a tattered coat that barely clung to his frail frame. A rusted tin cup sat in front of him, holding a few measly coins. The lunchtime crowd gave him a wide berth, some sneering in disgust, others pretending not to see him at all. Ryan had dealt with this before. The city had laws against loitering, and it was his job to enforce them. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and strode toward the man, already rehearsing the familiar words in his head. "Move along. You can't sit here. There's a shelter a few blocks down," but something stopped him. The man lifted his head. His face was weathered, his beard unkempt, but his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, were sharp, alert. There was no desperation in them, no guilt, just an unsettling calm, as if he knew something no one else did. Ryan hesitated. It was a split second, barely noticeable, but it was there. A strange sensation crawled up his spine, something unfamiliar. A feeling he rarely experienced in his line of work: unease. The man didn't speak. He didn't beg or explain himself. He simply watched, studying Ryan as if he were the one under scrutiny. The officer clenched his jaw, shaking off the strange moment. It didn't matter who this man thought he was. He couldn't stay here. Then, just as Ryan opened his mouth to speak, the air shifted. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb, the kind that only the wealthy could afford. The sound of the tires skidding slightly on the pavement turned heads, but it was what happened next that made time seem to freeze. The back door of the SUV swung open, and a sharply dressed man in a tailored suit practically leapt out. His face was pale, his movements rushed as he sprinted toward the homeless man. "Sir, we've been looking for you everywhere." The city noise faded into the background. Ryan barely registered the murmurs of the nearby pedestrians. His focus was locked on the scene unfolding in front of him. The suited man reached the homeless figure and, with surprising care, helped him to his feet. The old man sighed, brushing the dust off his ragged coat with slow, deliberate movements. Then, without looking back, he stepped toward the waiting vehicle. Ryan stood frozen, his mind racing. Who was this man? Why was a chauffeur acting like he'd just found a missing person? And most importantly, how could a homeless man carry himself with such quiet authority, as if he had been the one in control of this encounter the entire time? Before stepping into the car, the old man glanced back, a knowing smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Ryan felt the weight of his gaze. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, the man said something that made Ryan's blood run cold. "I told you, you don't know who you're talking to." And with that, the door shut. The SUV pulled away from the curb, disappearing into traffic, leaving only a stunned officer and a city that continued to move around him, unaware that something extraordinary had just happened. Ryan remained standing there for a long time, heart pounding, staring at the empty spot where the homeless man had just been. Somewhere deep in his gut, he knew. This was only the beginning. Officer Ryan Walker stood motionless, his pulse still racing from the strange encounter. The homeless man, no, whoever he really was, had vanished into the city, leaving behind nothing but questions. The weight of the man's final words lingered in Ryan's mind. "I told you, you don't know who you're talking to." The sentence gnawed at him. He had spent years on the force dealing with criminals, vagrants, and con artists. But this was different. This wasn't just another street case. There was something off, something unsettling about the way that man carried himself. Ryan wasn't the type to let things go. He prided himself on being thorough, on having an instinct for when something didn't add up. And right now? Nothing about this made sense. As he walked back to his patrol car, he pulled out his notepad and scribbled down what little information he had. Homeless man, blue eyes, white beard, wealthy driver, luxury SUV. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He would dig into this, but before he could sit down in his car, his radio crackled to life. Unit 32. We need officers at the Hudson Grand Hotel. Urgent situation on the premises. Ryan frowned. The Hudson Grand was one of the most expensive hotels in the city. It wasn't the kind of place that called the cops over something trivial. Without hesitation, he jumped into his cruiser, flipped on the sirens, and sped toward the location. The Hudson Grand was a towering monument of wealth, its golden doors gleaming under the afternoon sun. As Ryan pulled up, he could already see several hotel staff gathered near the entrance, whispering among themselves. A nervous-looking manager rushed toward him the moment he stepped out. "Thank goodness you're here, officer," the man said, wiping sweat from his brow. "We have a situation." Ryan's eyes swept over the pristine lobby, the shining marble floors, the enormous chandelier above. Everything looked normal. Too normal. "What kind of situation?" he asked, his tone firm. The manager hesitated before motioning for Ryan to follow him down a quiet hallway. They stopped at a door marked "Private Staff Only." The manager fumbled for his keycard, his fingers trembling slightly.
"We found him in here," he muttered. "At first we thought he was a trespasser, but then, well, you'll see." With a beep, the door unlocked and swung open. Ryan stepped inside and felt his stomach drop. Sitting in a plush leather chair,
in a luxurious private lounge, was the same homeless man he had just encountered outside the restaurant, except he didn't look homeless anymore. Gone were the tattered clothes. Now he wore an immaculate three-piece suit, tailored perfectly to his frame. His silver hair, once unkempt, was neatly combed back. A glass of expensive whiskey sat on the table beside him, next to a briefcase that looked like it was worth more than Ryan's entire salary, and those piercing blue eyes? They were the same, but now they held amusement, as if he had expected Ryan to be here. Ryan's breath hitched. What the hell was going on? The man leaned back in his chair and studied the officer with a smirk. Then he lifted his glass in a slow, deliberate toast. Ryan had no idea what he had just stepped into, but one thing was clear. This was only the beginning of something much, much bigger. Officer Ryan Walker stood frozen in the doorway of the luxurious private lounge. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing. Just hours ago, this man had been sitting on the streets in tattered clothes, rattling a tin cup for spare change. Now, he looked like he belonged among the city's elite, dressed in a tailored suit, sipping expensive whiskey in one of the most exclusive hotels in town. It wasn't possible, and yet, here he was. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with unspoken truths. The man studied Ryan with those same piercing blue eyes, the ones that had unsettled him earlier. But now there was something else in them, a hint of amusement, as if this had all been some elaborate game, and Ryan was the last one to realize he'd been playing. A low chuckle rumbled from the man's throat as he swirled the amber liquid in his glass. Ryan clenched his fists, forcing himself to remain professional. He had dealt with liars, con artists, and masterminds before. He wasn't about to let some rich man with a strange sense of humor get under his skin. His voice came out firm. "Who the hell are you?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow sip of his drink, savoring the moment. Then, with an air of complete nonchalance, he leaned forward and placed his glass down with a soft clink against the marble table. And then he smiled. "Tell me, officer," he said, his voice smooth, almost hypnotic. "Have you ever heard of William Caldwell?" Ryan frowned. The name stirred something in the back of his mind, a distant memory just out of reach. He had heard it before, but where? The man seemed to notice the flicker of recognition on Ryan's face, and his smile widened. "Ah, so you have heard of me," he mused. That makes this easier. Then it hit Ryan like a freight train. William Caldwell, a billionaire investor. A man who had once been one of the most powerful names in finance, known for his ruthless business strategies and uncanny ability to predict market shifts. He had built an empire, only to disappear 5 years ago. One day, he was everywhere, on magazine covers, news channels, billionaire lists. The next, he vanished without a trace. No one knew where he had gone. There were rumors. Some said he fled to another country, others claimed he had been killed in a secret financial war. But no one, not a single soul, had guessed the truth, that he had been living on the streets. Ryan felt his stomach twist. No, it couldn't be. There had to be a mistake. But as he looked at the man sitting before him, he knew. There was no mistake. William Caldwell wasn't dead. He wasn't missing. He had been here all along, on the streets, a homeless billionaire. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. "I see you're beginning to understand," Caldwell said, leaning back in his chair. "But I imagine you have a lot of questions, don't you?" Ryan could barely speak. This wasn't just a strange case anymore. This was something else entirely. And whatever the reason for Caldwell's disappearance, Ryan had the sinking feeling that the truth was far darker than he could ever imagine. The walls of the luxurious hotel lounge seemed to close in around Officer Ryan Walker as the weight of the revelation settled over him. William Caldwell, a billionaire, a financial mastermind, a man who had once controlled more wealth than entire corporations, had been living on the streets. Ryan's pulse hammered in his ears. Questions raced through his mind, each one more impossible than the last. Why would a man with everything disappear into nothing? What had happened to make him abandon his empire? And why was he sitting here now, acting like none of it mattered? Caldwell leaned back in his chair, watching Ryan with quiet amusement, as if he had seen this exact reaction before. "You look like a man trying to solve a puzzle without all the pieces," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. Ryan forced himself to speak, though his throat felt dry. "Why?" The question came out rough, demanding. Why would a billionaire fake his own disappearance and live as a homeless man? Caldwell exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Ryan thought he might refuse to answer. But then the man's gaze darkened, and when he spoke, the casual amusement was gone. "Because I was never supposed to leave." The word sent a chill through Ryan's spine. "What do you mean?" Caldwell took another sip of his whiskey, his fingers tapping lightly against the glass. "You think the world of business is built on numbers and strategy, Officer Walker?" he asked. "It's not. It's built on control." Ryan said nothing, letting the man continue. "There are people, powerful people, who don't like it when someone plays outside the rules. When someone becomes too successful, too unpredictable, too uncontrollable. I built something they couldn't manipulate, and for that, they wanted me gone." Ryan's jaw tightened. "Who?" Caldwell let out a humorless chuckle. "The ones who run everything. The ones you don't see in the headlines because they own the headlines." He paused, his expression darkening. "They gave me a choice. Either hand over my company, my assets, my influence, or disappear." Ryan felt his grip tighten into a fist. This was bigger than he had imagined. "And you chose to disappear?" he asked. Caldwell shook his head. "No. I refused. I thought I could fight them. I thought I was untouchable." A bitter smile crossed his lips. "I was wrong." He reached for the briefcase beside him and unlatched it with a slow click. Ryan expected stacks of money, maybe confidential documents. But what he saw instead made his stomach drop. Inside the briefcase were photographs. Dozens of them. Some were old, grainy security footage. Others were high-resolution surveillance shots. All of them were of Caldwell. Some showed him in his office, others at private events. But then, the images changed. a car following him down an empty road, a shadowy figure near his penthouse window, and then Ryan's blood ran cold. The last photo was of Caldwell sleeping in his own bed, taken from inside his home. "They wanted me to know," Caldwell said quietly. "They wanted me to see that no matter where I was, no matter how powerful I thought I was, they were always watching. They were always one step ahead." Ryan clenched his jaw, barely suppressing a shiver. "So, I ran," Caldwell continued. "I emptied my accounts, burned my identity, and vanished before they could make me disappear on their terms." He exhaled. "I chose to be nobody, rather than let them take everything from me." The weight of his words settled in the room like a storm cloud. Ryan had spent his career believing that power rested in the hands of the law, that no matter how rich or influential someone was, justice always had the final say. But now he wasn't so sure. Caldwell studied him for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "Still think this is just another street case, officer?" Ryan said nothing, because for the first time in his career, he didn't know if he was standing in the presence of a victim, or a man who had just declared war on the people who had tried to erase him. The weight of William Caldwell's story pressed down on Officer Ryan Walker like a lead weight. Everything he had ever believed about power, justice, and control had been shattered in the last few minutes. He had spent his entire career thinking that the law was the ultimate force in society. But now, sitting in this private lounge, staring at the man who had once been one of the most powerful figures in finance, only to be erased by forces even greater, he wasn't sure of anything anymore. Caldwell's fingers traced the edge of the briefcase, his eyes dark with something between exhaustion and determination. "I didn't come back to reclaim my fortune, officer," he said quietly. "I came back to end this." Ryan's stomach twisted. "End what?" he asked, though he was almost afraid to hear the answer. Caldwell leaned forward, his voice calm but unwavering. "The people who did this to me. The ones who decide who gets to rise and who disappears. I've spent years gathering proof. Files, recordings, transactions that shouldn't exist. I've spent my time in the shadows, watching them the way they once watched me. And now—" His lips curled into a smirk, but there was no humor in it. "It's time to make them pay." Ryan exhaled slowly. "You're talking about going after some of the most powerful people in the world." Caldwell's smirk didn't fade. "Exactly." The words sent a chill through Ryan's bones. He wasn't dealing with a man who had been broken by his downfall. He was dealing with someone who had waited, who had planned, and who was now ready to strike back. The officer ran a hand through his hair, his instincts warring with his sense of duty. Was Caldwell insane? Or was he the only person brave enough to fight a battle no one else dared to? Before he could say another word, Caldwell stood and buttoned his suit jacket. The ease with which he moved, the effortless confidence, was a stark contrast to the man Ryan had seen hours ago, hunched over in a tattered coat on the streets. This was the real Caldwell, the one they had tried to destroy. "You have a choice, officer," he said, slipping on a sleek, expensive-looking watch. "You can walk out of here, pretend you never saw me, and go back to writing parking tickets and chasing small-time criminals, or you can be part of something bigger." Ryan's throat tightened. "And what exactly is that?" Caldwell's piercing blue eyes locked onto his, the weight of his next words unmistakable. "Revenge." Silence hung between them, thick and electric. For years, Ryan had believed in the system, believed that justice always found its way. But here he was, faced with undeniable proof that justice could be bought, controlled, and erased, and for the first time in his life, he wondered if the real fight wasn't in the streets with criminals, but in the boardrooms, behind closed doors, where men like Caldwell had once played the game, until he refused to follow the rules. Ryan took a slow breath, his pulse steadying. He thought about his job, his badge, his duty, and then he thought about the look in Caldwell's eyes, a man who had lost everything A man who had nothing left to fear. A man who was about to shake the very foundations of power. Finally, Ryan spoke. "Well, where do we start?" Caldwell smiled. And just like that, the war began. What do you think about this story? Have you ever seen someone get put in their place like this? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. Don't forget to tap the bell icon to stay updated. Your support means the world.